I've always wondered how people in Minnesota and Canada and those super cold places like that dealt with this before we had insulation. I mean, you just have monstrous boilers or wood stoves or whatever, right?
Yeah, and I think you were just cold.
Yeah, right.
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Podcast, our weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. I'm joined by Digital Brand Manager Rob Wadsack.
Hey.
Kiley Jacques, Design Editor.
Hello.
And Producer Jeff Rose.
Hey.
Please email us your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Well, it is very nice to see you all here this morning. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks. Yeah, you too.
I'm starting to forget what you guys look like.
What have you been up to, Kiley? You been keeping busy?
Yeah, I'm getting ready to weed whack a significant swath of bank that's overgrown with weeds. And last year I didn't do it and regretted that because I wound up not having a view of the river anymore. So my neighbor's charging his electric string trimmer for me. And that should make it a lot easier than what I had been doing.
Have you tried that machine before?
No. I mean, I've used weed whackers, but I haven't tried an electric one. I'm looking forward to it. I hear him using it a lot. I only want to do it twice a season, so it didn't seem like something I needed to buy, and he's super nice about offering to let me use it. So,
do you know what brand it is?
I don't. I'm not sure.
Tell us.
I know he plugged it in. That's all I need to know.
We'll expect a full review in the next podcast, okay?
I think it should be fun.
All right. How about you, Rob? What have you been doing? You keeping busy?
Yeah, I'll just comment on that string trimmer quick. I've got a Ryobi one with the 40-volt battery in it, and I used to hate string trimmers, but it was, I think, mostly because of the inconvenience of them, because I was never good at maintaining gas engines, and I hated running a cord out for a stupid plug-in one. And I got this hell strip out on my sidewalk that I never maintained because it was just a hassle. Yeah. And now I just run in the shed, grab the electric weed whacker, it's ready to go, pull the trigger, clip the grass. It's actually really nice. And it's the 40-volt ones are pretty powerful. So, But anyway, my project, I mentioned last time that I was working on that stoop on the side step. And so I built it's a little side porch covered porch off the side of my house next to my driveway, which we never used because I hadn't gotten to building steps for it yet. And now that we have this step, it's basically a 2x6 box on little short 4x4 posts with some synthetic decking. And I had some nice stone lying around from some other projects. So I actually built a stone step and then this box. And then so it's a nice 2-step up to the deck. And it's actually been really nice. It kind of rounds out the landscaping on that side of the house.
It's super sharp. I saw that photo of it. We should put that
thanks.
up.
It looks fantastic.
We need to put that up for everybody to see. That's gorgeous. It's
cool.
Really nice, Rob. What'd you use for that stain? I like that color a lot.
No, it's actually plastic decking.
Oh, right. So, maybe I wasn't listening closely enough.
So no, on the back of my house where we spend all our time, I splurged for some nice ipe for my back porch. But since my house already has vinyl siding and it's covered in plastic, I figure in a place where I don't see it that often, I use some synthetic decking I bought at Home Depot. And it's unfortunate. I mean, I love the fact that I don't have to maintain it, but it's if my house was a little bit more original to the 1870s, details, I would have definitely done a wood step instead.
I can tell you, Rob, if they would have had that material in the 1870s, they would have used it too.
Yeah,
how
about
about you,
Jeff?
Jeff?
My house.
Oh, it's just, I mean, our synthetic decking is very popular for a good reason, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Jeff, have you torn into your wall oven? I am dying to know how that has gone.
I have not touched it since we last spoke. But
it looks like a nightmare.
I know.
Yeah, kind of.
Patrick, you'd be all over that.
I do no.
You wouldn't sleep until you were done.
I would just start replacing electronic components until it started working correctly or until I had to buy a new oven.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's like there aren't parts available, so I need to find out. Get right down to the actual component. I can't replace boards or anything like that because they're not available.
How old is it?
Yeah.
18 years old.
And
So
it's
you're
a
in there,
Bosch?
Yeah.
So you're like soldering in new capacitors and stuff like that, or?
Well, I haven't found where I think it's probably a relay, but I need to do some signal tracing and find that. So
I would be
Well,
tempted to
my regular
wire
life.
that little fan that cools off the circuit board to like a wall switch, and I would turn that on before I turned on the oven and just like do it that way.
Yeah, it may come down to that. I may, because actually, as soon as you turn the oven on, the lights come on. So maybe I'll wire it to those. I don't know.
What could possibly go wrong? That's what I want to know.
Good for you.
Yeah, sometimes those workarounds, as shady as they seem, like a kind of a simpler one. My gas grill, the igniter went on it, and it was going to be like $10 or something like that to replace it. But I had a couple of those handheld torches lying around, so I just keep one of those things underneath with the gas grill, and it's like, why spend money on something like that? But I guess it's a little bit more serious when you have electronics components inside your house.
Yeah.
Yeah, in a wooden cabinet, like. So Liam's bed comes today. The mattress comes today, and the new sheets came yesterday. So hopefully tonight Liam will be sleeping in his new bed, and I will be grateful to not be working on it anymore. I had another unplanned project this week. My lovely wife took a load of rotting cordwood to the dump that's been in our landscape since our huge storm. And while she was there, she dumped the stuff and then was leaving the place, and the brakes in the pickup truck failed.
Oh, no.
Like the pedal just went right to the floor.
Ugh.
And she didn't have her cell phone. She couldn't call me to ask what to do, so she drove it home
Oh, my
with
God.
no brakes.
How far?
So those of you who are listening, the fail-safe in a hydraulic braking system separates the front and rear brakes. So if you have a catastrophic failure, theoretically, if you have it in the front, the rear brakes will still work, or the front brakes will still work if you have it in the back. Well, in most vehicles, the front brakes do about 75% of the braking. And so she had 25% of the braking, and that's not even a full. You can't rely on that. It's just meant to stop you safely so you can get the thing towed and repaired. But she drove it home, and didn't die. And I just bring this up not to chastise her, but for those of you listening, when your brakes fail, don't try and drive home, even though it seems like they're working. Yeah, just don't do it.
No, I did that in college with. I had a Volkswagen Rabbit that I blew a wheel cylinder on, and that brake system was diagonal. So you'd have one front and one rear brake when you lost one wheel cylinder. And I tried to drive that thing home from visiting a friend at college, and got, being stupid when I was 18 years old, got like within a few miles of my parents' house, and then someone slammed on their brakes in front of me, and I buried the thing in a guardrail to avoid hitting them.
Oh, man. Yeah. So those of you listening, don't ride without brakes. So I had to replace the brake hose on the pickup truck, and that took a couple trials. I won't bore you with the details, but suffice to say, at first I got the wrong part because it was in the wrong box, and then I had to replace the caliper too because the bleeder wouldn't move. So it turned into a little bit of a project, but everything's cool now. Wow. So this weekend, I think we're going to take a little break and maybe work outside, hopefully. But my plan for outside work this weekend is it's supposed to rain all weekend and we won't have to do it. So I'm hopefully going to be a slug. Anyway, so we got some great feedback. Some of it's related to episode 176. Hey, FHB podcast folk. I always enjoy your banter. And the practical advice, too. In episode 176, I heard the discussion about Matt having an altercation with poison ivy, and the Zanfell Technu Gojo approach didn't seem to help. I'm a lifelong victim of poison ivy. The most practical things I discovered was written by a blog by a person who led hiking trips. On hikes, they carried a spray bottle filled with household ammonia diluted 9-to-1 with water. The allergen, urushiol, I had to put this phonetically and I still can't pronounce it, is mildly acidic and oily. Theoretically, the diluted ammonia solution instantly neutralizes the acidic urushiol and helps it release from clothing and tools. I've used this approach for the past 15 years and have had zero rashes. I should mention that I am also extremely careful to avoid contacting the poison ivy in the first place. Therefore, I have the age-old problem of how do you prove something that did not happen? Sorry, my past rashes were so annoying that I've never taken the scientific approach by intentionally rubbing poison ivy on my skin and then treating it with ammonia to prove it works.
Yeah, don't blame
Fair
him.
enough.
Yeah.
I'm not a chemist or dermatologist, so use this with caution on your clothing, boots, and tools that may have contacted poison ivy. I'm sure ammonia is not recommended for direct skin contact by the medical community, so make your own decisions in that regard. And for sure, don't inhale the stuff. The other option is to try an acid neutralizer that's much safer, baking soda. I've never tried baking soda because the ammonia has worked for me. Lastly, the time before treatment matters. I read one dermatology study that said 50% of the urushiol is already penetrated the skin after about 10 minutes. After an hour, it's 100% penetrated. In other words, act fast to avoid the rash. The study also indicated that past resistance does not guarantee future resistance. Similar to uncured epoxy reagents, repeated exposure can lead to a developed sensitivity where none existed in the past.
Amen,
I didn't
brother.
know that there was a sensitivity to epoxy reagents either. I'm learning all kinds of stuff in this correspondence. So, Randy, thank you for that information. Have you tried this, Kiley?
No, I've actually had luck with the tech news stuff that Matt recommended. I also have a terrible reaction to it.
Have you tried this, Rob? Jeff?
No, when I was younger, I never used to get poison ivy at all. And now if I get it at all, it's always like a mild case on my wrists, like if I'm pulling weeds and stuff, and it never gets any worse than that. So I just kind of scrub it with some Dawn dish soap as soon as I notice it. And that, I don't know if that helps. But.
You know what's weird, though, is that Matt recommended that product to me, and I used it and it worked. And then he had a terrible case of it, and he said that just didn't work. But I think it's a matter of timing.
Yeah, and he also gave up on it too quickly.
Yeah, I think so,
at
too.
least the Zanfel, you have to use that for days. And, he's cheap like the rest of us, so...
It's not cheap, the product.
No, it's like $50, right, for the bar of soap? Thanks, Randy, for that information. We also heard from somebody, we're talking about mini splits on this show a lot. Like, I think, we used to talk about air sealing every question, but more recently, every question involves a mini split. Either someone is considering them or someone who's got comfort problems and is probably needs one. So we heard from a longtime listener of the podcast. I forget who this is. Sorry. I often hear you talk about the wonders of a mini split system and want to provide some of my own experience. I would say it's not the panacea of HVAC. We have a tight, efficient house in central Texas. The HVAC was designed for July and August, where Delta T can be 35 degrees, 110 and humid outside. Our issue with the mini split is on mild winter days when we just need a little bit of heat. The Mitsubishi units have a minimum operating output, I think around 6,000 BTUs, that exceeds the requirements on these days. We go to bed with the thermostat set at 68 degrees, and by morning the temp is in mid 75 because the unit can't turn off its output. We end up just not heating the house because I'd rather sleep cold than wake up hot. Also in the spring and fall, one day it might be 85 outside, the next day 55. We have to run around and switch all the units from cooling to heating. I know, first world problems, but we are beginning the stages of building a new house and we are going back to central forced air. I lived in Norwich for 4 years and don't miss your winters. Take care from the Lone Star State. Well, that's interesting feedback. I just think his mini split is too big for the low load conditions, but he's in a difficult spot because he needs a bigger unit for when he's cooling. But in the wintertime, his the minimum output of this unit is too much, so it overheats his house. We actually corresponded, and I asked him if he had a external thermostat. So the mini splits have an internal thermostat, and oftentimes, especially, depending if you're in a predominantly heating climate, in cooling season, sometimes it won't cool it adequately because the thermostat is too close to the unit. So if you get an external thermostat, it helps alleviate some of these problems. So he does have an external thermostat, and he's hacked some of the Mitsubishi controls. There are some internal menus that allow you to tweak the settings. So he's going to wait for another shoulder season and see if that has improved his comfort. But I think it's interesting to have someone whose experience with mini splits has not been all that positive, which is interesting.
It's, I guess the silver lining is that he's got a house that's well insulated enough that a 6,000 BTU mini split is too big to heat it,
Yeah. I'm curious, and I haven't called it Mitsubishi, but shouldn't this thing turn off if the thermostat is satisfied? Why does it keep making heat? That's weird, right?
Yeah. Well, the one thing I have learned with my mini splits is that there's no display anywhere of the room temperature that it's measuring, and the only digital display on, at least on the handheld remotes that I have, is your set point. And I find that the set point is never, and the guys even warned me about this, though, the set point is never going to be exactly what it is, because it's measuring it at the unit. It's not measuring it at the remote. But at the same time, they have an infrared eye that scans the room and is supposed to adjust the vanes in the vents so that it directs air where it's needed most. And
that's what they tell you that eye is for, Rob.
It's really just spying on you.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of people who worry about that.
I'd put tape over mine if it were me.
Do you think it works? That functionality? Do you think it's not accurate?
Oh,
the eye.
Oh, it's I have no way of really knowing. There's these systems get so much more high tech and complex nowadays. It's it's kind of like the same idea of how do you know if an air cleaning system in your house or an air quality measuring system is working? There's nothing you can look at to say, oh yeah, it's 30 microns per whatever this cleaner than it was. It's how are you supposed to know? It's complicated.
Mm-hmm.
But that is another annoying thing though about the whole switching between cooling and heating, because you do have, especially if you have a multi-head unit with a mini split, all the heads have to be either on cooling or heating. So you have to make sure that you at least turn them all off and turn them back to the setting that you want, whether it's heating or cooling. I try to just get through the shoulder months without running the thing at all, and then switch it. But if you're in a place a place that has huge temperature swings, I guess it's probably a lot more complicated.
Are you happy with yours? Are you glad you have them?
I am. Yeah. I mean, again, my house is not super well insulated. There's a ways to go if I want to make it to the point where the mini splits alone will heat my house. I've run the pellet stove in the wintertime, and not every room is super comfortable in the coldest days. In the summer, it's awesome. Similar kind of situation to him. In the summer, I have no complaints. Every single room in the house is super comfortable, and the air conditioning keeps up with even though my house is kind of chopped up and I only have 3 head units. But yeah, the winter is a little bit harder for me to regulate.
I find it interesting, his maximum delta T that he's talking about is 35 degrees. And I was talking to Peter Kolchik earlier in the week, right, Jeff, and he was talking about living in Minneapolis, where the wintertime temperature can be 40 below, and you're trying to keep the house at 65 or 70 degrees. You're talking about 110 degree delta T. And it's that's why the insulation requirements are so much less in the southern states, because you just don't have the drive, right? The heat, the energy flow. Fascinating.
I've always wondered how people in Minnesota and Canada and those super cold places like that dealt with this before we had insulation. I mean, you just have monstrous boilers or wood stoves or whatever, right?
Yeah. And I think you were just cold.
Yeah.
And I think you probably wore long underwear in the house, some winter nights, right? To keep from freezing to death.
I would love to have some of our, older northern podcast listeners write in to give us some feedback about that, because it seems like it has to have been miserable for some people before we had good insulation and heating systems.
I think that's fair to say.
The coldest temperature I've ever experienced was minus 40 below real temperature, and that was at my wife's aunt and uncle's house in Burke, Vermont, which is closer to Canada than anywhere else in the United States. And your tires have flat spots frozen into them when you try and leave, and it's like until they get rounded out again, and it actually hurts to breathe in those temperatures. It is unbelievable.
Sounds awesome. I like the cold. You guys know I love winter.
You lived in New Hampshire. It's cold there, right?
Yeah, this guy's from Texas, and he said, I don't like your winters. Well, he hasn't been back here in a few years. They're temperate now.
It seems different, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Should we take some questions?
Yeah.
All right. This first one comes from Ken from New Jersey by way of New Hampshire. We'll get to what that's about in a sec here. Hey, FHB podcast. Really enjoying the podcast, especially since I have more free time on my hands these days. As a private school teacher and part-time carpenter, I was able to relocate to New Hampshire and continue renovation on my own house, checking off jobs much faster than if I'd stayed in New Jersey. So far, I've installed the kitchen boxes, IKEA, and most of the drawer fronts, Plykea. Also gutted a bathroom, painted 2 rooms, installed a shower pan, lots of trim, and I'm expecting a door delivery tomorrow. My question has to do with an FHB white paper on insulating the rim joist with VersaFoam. I'll get this one done this summer. No need to do it right now. Do I use closed cell or open cell? I understand the difference, but which is right for my heating climate? I have a full cellar, which is pretty dry, unconditioned space, and it has our oil-fired heating boiler and laundry in it. It has an 8-foot uninsulated ceiling, and yes, I believe there is a vapor barrier under the concrete floor, as the house was built in 1999, and that was probably practice here in southern New Hampshire. The foundation is poured concrete, and it looks like it was ICF since there is 3 inches of foam panels on both inside and outside the foundation. Does it matter if I use open or closed cell on the rim joist? Lastly, do you ever invite regular folk on the show? Hint, hint, given how we're all working separately these days, it might be fun to have a regular guy on the show, even if he has been reading Fine Homebuilding since the 90s. Take care, and I'd love to know if any of you have used the VersaFoam kits in your own houses. Best, Ken. So what is Ken talking about here, people? You want to go into that, Rob?
Yeah, so basically the difference between the open cell and closed cell foam is how much moisture, how permeable it is, how much moisture can get through there. So,
and chemically, it's very different.
Sure, and yeah. I guess the closed cell typically is a higher R value too. Isn't that correct?
Yep.
So one concern in places where you have humidity is you usually want to use the closed cell foam so that you don't get moisture migrating to the cold side of the foam if there's some water sensitive material in there, or if you have a high moisture load in the space. So a rim joist in a basement typically is safe to say that you should probably minimize any moisture moving through to your foundation or to your framing attached to your foundation. So I would think closed cell, especially in a mid-Atlantic or northern climate. But I'm no expert at that. I mean, based on the stuff I've talked about all the GBA contributors with, that just seems like my best guess.
So it's going to be closed cell, because if you're going to spray foam yourself, that's really your only option. So the open cell foam is a water-based blowing agent, or it's water actually, and that requires a professional spray rig. So if you're going to buy one of these 2-component kits from the home center or mail order, those are all going to be closed cell foam. And it's been a long time now, but I did an article in 2011 that looked at a number of these kits, including the VersaFoam product, and I tested all these in Justin's attic. So
yeah, I was there.
Yeah, you were there?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I learned a lot about using these things. I had never used them before. And as part of a test, I decided to buy all these things and then use them on Justin's house, because why would I do my own house and risk messing it up? So I'll link that article on the podcast page, and it talks a lot about these things. I think these are a necessary evil, but they are evil in some regards. For starters, they have a very high global warming potential. And the rules in my mind are very fuzzy on how to dispose of the cylinders, because the chemicals are toxic, and you're not allowed to just throw toxic stuff into a landfill. And the manufacturers give you very little guidance on how to dispose of these properly. They tell you that disposal must be in accordance with local, state, and federal guidelines, except, they don't tell you what that is and how to do it. So
that means you bring it to the dump.
That's what it means, I'm sure. And so, I mean, like in some instances, it is a great air sealing and means to solve thermal bypasses when there's no other alternative. But I mean, for most of us, like, yes, the band joist is a huge energy suck on your house, but it's easy enough to insulate with cut and cobble, right? So you get yourself some polyiso or some XPS or EPS, and you cut it to fit in between the joists. And if you leave like a 3/8 inch gap on all sides, then you foam that with can spray foam, and you get a good tight seal, and you don't have the environmental impact of these two kits. And like I said, there's sometimes a necessary evil, but it's also the kind of thing is like, when you crack this kit, you better be prepared to use it all at once, right? If you try and start and stop this process, it's conceivable that the hoses are going to get plugged, or at least the nozzle, right? And they do give you a bunch of nozzles on the plastic gun they give you to spray the foam, but it can still get clogged up. And if you're cutting cobbling this same area, you can work on that more at your leisure, right? You can do even a joist bay a day if you want to drag it out. And I actually, when the Caulk for Clunkers program was going on, and during the Great Recession, there was a lot of incentives for folks to improve the energy performance of their homes. I actually had a guy come in and do this work for us and do another couple of little air sealing projects for, I think after the state and federal incentives, it was like $200 or something, and it would have cost $1,000. So
that's awesome.
It was awesome. It's hard to know how much difference that's made in the comfort or energy performance of our home, but it seems more airtight in the basement at a minimum.
How do you guys get rid of your spray foam cans? What do you do with those?
Well, it's the same kind of issue, really. I mean, except for the fact that those cans will harden up because all of the components are in one container. So you're going to get a solidified polyurethane foam in there eventually, especially if you're using it all up. So it's a little bit less of a concern than having liquid single parts of a multi-part system inside a canister that you're trying to dispose of. I've
been curious to see how Justin's attic is performing. I'd love to know if he's kept track of his energy bills to see if the air sealing we did up there has helped the performance of his home. I saw him do a video on story on Instagram recently where he was planning, I think, finishing some of that space off, because I saw him trying to figure out how to work around the old skinny framing in his old Craftsman kit house. And, he was sort of pointing out working around some of the framing around that foam. It looked like it was still good as the day we put it in there. One thing that was really weird to me, Rob, and I don't know if you remember this, is like, so we did a lot of that work at in a few hours, and I just remember that space got boiling because of the chemical reaction that was going on. I don't know if you remember that. Yeah, I do remember us noticing it. I don't remember it clearly, like how significant it was, but that is one of the biggest concerns with spray foam is that each type of foam is supposed to be sprayed in certain thickness lifts, so pay close attention to the manufacturer's instructions. Because I remember when spray foam first started getting popular, we had a couple of news stories on Green Building Advisor about houses spontaneously combusting because people did like a 6-inch lift of foam, and it just generated so much heat from the chemical reaction.
Is it hard to control that, though? Is it hard to control?
Well, no, actually, yeah. I mean, those guns are, just like any spraying system, like spray painting, spraying guns, the gun itself should have some adjustments on it, but also how fast you move with a gun is how thick the lift will be when you're spraying.
Yeah, so they spray a little bit, Kiley, and then walk away from it to let it give off some heat. The risk is when you make the foam layer too big, the outside cures before the inside, and it kind of locks the heat in, and it keeps building and building until you may remember, Rob and Jeff, the guy who has a basement drying franchise. Like, he also does weatherization and energy retrofit work, and he used spray foam in his own home, and it caught fire the day that they were doing that because it was a super hot day. I'm guessing it was miserable up in the attic, and those guys just wanted to get the heck out of there, so they sprayed too much foam at once and ended up burning this house down.
Yeah. Yeah, the right way to do it would be to basically circle the room a few times, so that you're just doing, I mean, just like you would be doing with paint. You only put on as much as you need, and you let it dry, and you come back around when it's dry enough when it's cured enough to put the next coat.
You must have to have full-on PPE, right?
Oh yes, you don't want to be breathing that stuff.
They have air supplied respirators, and it's toxic stuff, no
Nasty,
doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been on projects where they're spraying inside the structure, and you can smell it outside. Can't be good for you. Our next question. Hi, crew. I enjoy the podcast, and I'm thrilled we've tabled the air sealing conversations for a bit. It seems like we need an air sealing question, Rob. My company is starting a renovation on a house in Newtown. And for those of you who are listening might not be aware, but Newtown is where our Taunton Press offices are. So it's a 1950s, 2,300 square foot cape. I bought the house as a foreclosure and is in need of a lot of work. It is 2x4 stud framed, and the interior walls are all plaster. The previous owner was a jack of all trades and replaced some of the siding, left some parts without siding, and left some of the original clapboard. My plan is to remove all the siding, existing sheathing, and resheathe and then reside the house. My concern is the insulation is going to need to be replaced as well, but I do not want to gut the plaster to properly re-insulate. Most of the interior walls are in good condition and definitely worth saving. Spray foam is out of my budget, especially since with 2x4 walls, I would need to specify closed cell to satisfy code. I'm thinking of using unfaced rolled insulation installed from the outside, then installing a vapor barrier before the sheathing. Keep in mind, budget is a concern here as well as time. I'd be open to any suggestions you may have. If you ever want a socially distanced tour of the house as close to your offices, you can feel free to reach out. And this is from Sean.
I want to check out that house.
Sean wants to insulate this house from the outside.
Right, so rigid foam, right?
So he said he was concerned about spray foam for budget, but also for being able to have enough to meet code. But it sounds like 2x4 walls, he's not going to be able to do that with, loose fill insulation anyway. So
well, maybe the inspection entity will allow him to use batts because of the framing, but if he's going to use spray foam, they might not allow him to use closed cell. I'm speculating, but
also, but like you said, budget is his big concern since it's.
What about recycled rigid foam? Is that not an applicable solution here?
Well, it could be, especially if he put it on the outside.
That's what I mean. Isn't that
cutting,
what he wants
cobbling
to do?
A house worth of. Well, that would certainly be a good idea.
Well, am I understanding
what he's
that he wants to do it to the outside?
I didn't see that, Kiley.
Oh,
my understanding is he wants to pull off the existing siding and sheathing, right, and then re-insulate the stud cavities and then put sheathing back and then reside. But he could definitely use batts and reclaimed insulation on the exterior. That would be a much better wall. I don't see any problem with him using batts in the stud cavities. I think mineral wool would be better than fiberglass just because it fits better. I wouldn't put the vapor barrier on at all. You want drying, and it's better to have drying in both directions in most climates. So in this climate, I would definitely omit the vapor barrier, especially on the outside. That is definitely not where you want it, because we are in a predominantly heating climate. So it should be on the inside to prevent if you use it, and you shouldn't, in all but the coldest parts. But am I making sense, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it seems reasonable to do to do the batts, and like you said, mineral wool is something that would be easy to press in there. Especially if he's talking about unfaced batts. Why not do something that's easier to install? Because fiberglass unfaced batts on a vertical surface are not exactly the most fun thing to install. But I'm just trying to figure out if how far does he want to go here? Because it maybe a combination of that and some exterior insulation would be a nice solution. But we don't know. Do we know if he's removing the windows at all? Because one of the problems with doing a renovation and having exterior insulation is then you have to tie your flashing into the existing windows. But that's kind of, if you're stripping all the siding and sheathing off anyway, that's still kind of a concern. I've always wondered about that. That's like one of the biggest concerns to me is like, how do you detail the windows and doors if you're doing stuff like this from the outside? And everyone always says, you got to do your flashing when the windows go in. But then at the same time, I also wonder about that because of we just did an article in the recent issue about inset windows and flashing them, flangeless windows. And it seems to me like flashing to the old if you're pulling off the exterior window trim, flashing to the old jambs is kind of the same process, right? The old window frames. So
yeah, and he's taking off the sheathing, so I can't imagine how he's doing that without pulling the windows, right? Because the windows were installed over the sheathing almost certainly, so it seems like he's going to have to take out the windows just to get the sheathing off.
That's a monster project.
I suppose you could cut around them, but I think that would be... It's a big project. So... the upshot of this is I've been in contact with Sean, and soon I'm going to go do a properly social distance tour of this house, and hopefully I'll take some video of what's going on here. And that might be a cool thing to integrate into the podcast, is where we could actually have a little video clip to show what we're looking at. And that might be something we can do more often if you all send little videos of your questions. That I think that would be very interesting.
That would be very cool.
We're going to get to this, I think. Actually, one of the guys mentioned, do we have people on the show? That, like you said, that's kind of a neat way to actually have them on the show. Perhaps.
Yeah. I like that.
It seems totally reasonable, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Kiley, what do you think about me going on a tour? Do you think that's folly?
You mean health-wise? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Well,
yes, that's what I'm talking about.
I think you're a very smart guy and know what to do, and just keep your boundaries. I don't know. I personally wouldn't, but anything for fine home building.
Well, especially since we're talking about exterior details, I think it's going to be a little easier.
You're going to be outside with them, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, the one thing about this whole situation is we live in.
I'm going to wear my.
Yep. Oh, I was going to say we live in a reasonably spread out area, so it is a little bit easier than in some places to maintain safe distance and still go about certain activities.
Yeah.
So.
I'm going to wear my cartridge respirator, and I find that when I wear that, like, people keep a safe distance automatically. They're just like, what is going on here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got an old gas mask lying around.
I've had to go to the auto. Yeah.
I feel like that might be a little too much.
So I went to the auto parts store. A couple times this week, and those guys at the counter, no mask. Yeah. They're handling each other's phones, and I mean, like, maybe you can't wear a mask if you have to answer the phone all day with people's phone calls. I don't know. Maybe it's like just impossible to talk on the phone that way. Yeah. But they seem totally unfazed by this whole thing. It was very odd.
This whole thing's made me realize that I missed my calling. I should have been a cop. I feel like enforcing the law.
So do you tell people? Like, would you tell these guys, what are you guys doing? You wear a mask? Why?
No, I'll just keep it to myself. But I'm very judgy. Anyway, be careful if you go.
And I, in turn, was like, yeah. Got to get out of the house, Kiley.
I know. I hear you. All right. Next question.
So our next question comes from Adam, and he is in Southern Ontario. Hey, gang, I love the podcast. I'm an electrician by trade, but I'm in the middle of a remodel in addition of a house in Southern Ontario that we intend to live in with our family of 4. I'll lay it out for you and then ask a couple questions. I understand you probably can't use all of this, but if you pick and choose any to answer on the show or privately, your vast experience will be greatly appreciated. Well, he knows how to butter us up, huh? We're talking about a 2-story house with a block wall foundation, poured concrete floor in the basement, 2x10 4-ply laminated beam for the main floor, 2x10 joists. Above that is 4-inch tongue and groove subfloor. The second story is 2x8 joists with old crate planks, mostly 3/4 inch for a subfloor, and that will definitely be replaced. The roof is 2x4 rafters with collar ties and a knee wall. The upper floor overhangs the house 21 inches on all sides. So let's try and unpack this here. So this house is what I would describe as a garrison colonial, except it's like 1.5 stories. Like the roof is gabled, but even on the gable ends, the second story overhangs the first floor by 21 inches. And
it's pretty top heavy.
It's sort of like
it's very
challenging. Yeah, it's sort of like the both of the most challenging details of a garrison colonial and a cape, because they've got the soffits open up into the upper floor knee walls, and you also have an overhang on all sides that you got to worry about air sealing. Not that, but the good thing is that he's got it completely opened up, which is going to make that job a lot easier.
He's getting to the questions here. The biggest things I'm struggling with is the exterior wall assembly. Initially, I was planning for closed cell spray foam 3 inches, a new WRB on the exterior, then exterior insulation and a vented rain screen. Luckily, with cement board style horizontal siding, likely with horizontal fiber cement siding, it has come to my attention that exterior insulation with closed cell spray foam is a no-no because it can't dry inward due to the spray foam, and it can't dry to the outside because of the foam insulation, rigid foam insulation. Do you all have any suggestions? I'd prefer not to lose more room on the interior. Otherwise, flash and batt would work well, I think. Also, am I better with a peel and stick WRB or not? I'm concerned with a peel and stick sticking to the old planks with so many seams. Would it provide a good air barrier? What are your thoughts on header hangers to save on wood around windows and add more insulation? All right, so let's take these one at a time. What do you think about the foam insulation on top of wall assembly with closed cell spray foam on the interior?
I mean, it wouldn't be the first person to do that, but people, obviously, the more water sensitive layers you sandwich in between other layers that are not drying in either direction, you have a little bit higher risk. But at the same time, if your outside flashing and air sealing details are really good, that's probably not quite as dangerous as you might think.
That's what I'm saying. You got to you got to be meticulous, and I think an electrician is probably better than most people to do this kind of work, right? Then you need to be fussy, and you need to make sure that your flashing details are spot on, and water's not getting behind that, because as he suggests, if it does, there's no way it's going to dry. It's just going to rot in between the two, impermeable layers.
Yeah.
What I think is a fantastic idea in this situation is rigid mineral wool on the exterior, because it allows drying and it doesn't have the moisture accumulation that foam insulation does. So it's a little bit more difficult to install a rain screen and siding on top of that, because it wants to compress under the furring strips. But you can make that work, and it solves the problem that you're worried about.
Is that Gutex?
He also
Patrick?
asks about I'm sorry?
Was that Gutex? Is that what you're talking about?
No. The Gutex is more of a wood-based exterior sheathing insulation board.
Oh, he said mineral. What did he say?
Yeah,
what did you say? Mineral. Okay, got it.
Mineral wool. Mm-hmm. He also asked about a self-adhere WRB. I think that is a great solution for his board sheathing, and I've known people to do that. They do sell a primer, and it's expensive, but it's probably going to be necessary on these dirty old boards to make it stick. But my understanding is, you have to install this primer and the WRB in the right conditions. It has to be warm enough. But once again, follow the instructions, and I'm pretty sure that'll work very well. I believe we had a story in the tools and materials department in the magazine when it was called that, by Tyler Grace, I believe it was, and he used Henry Blueskin on a house with board sheathing, and it worked pretty well. So I think that's a good solution for you, Adam.
Yeah, I'll look for that
Header
article.
hangers. I hate header hangers. I like... they're expensive, and when you use header hangers, and yes, we should be all trying to use less wood in the wood part of our framing, right? In the house frame, but there's no like way you can affix casing if you have header hangers, because then the window opening isn't wide enough to receive the casing in many instances. And like, how do you hang like window treatments and stuff? Like, I'm a fan of OVE framing, but I think header hangers are just taking it one step too far. And they also tend to make this like lump in your drywall directly above the window. And that makes it's very obvious because the trim calls attention to it. So I'm just going to say I don't like header hangers. We could probably get a bunch of angry email from folks who are fans, but not for me.
Yeah, I mean, if you're starting from scratch and building a advanced framing home, I mean, like you were saying, if he could put enough of the right kind of exterior insulation on the house, I think that would more than make up for any kind of savings he wants to do by making the framing more complicated on the inside.
Yeah, and I mean, once again, I try not to recommend spray foam because of the, environmental penalty associated with using it. But I don't see any other way to insulate this wacky house effectively. It's gonna have to be that. And this, Rob, your point is excellent. That this house has the most complicating details of two problem home types. One, it has the knee wall of a cape, and two, it has the overhanging first floor of the Garrison Colonial. These are both like known energy problems with air leakage and cold spots, right? So I think the only way to fix this is with spray foam, sadly.
I mean, if it weren't for those awkward overhangs and knee walls, I would say if he felt like skipping the spray foam, he could just put more exterior insulation and do some window, deep window bucks, and really, do some bats or mineral wool or something like their blown in insulation on the 2x4s, and then just make up for the lack of R value there by putting thicker layers of rigid insulation on the outside. But then he's still got to deal with, at the overhang and the knee wall, some way to transition that. And you could certainly do that on the inside with some rigid foam and some really good air sealing details, but it's a lot of busy work to get those in between every single one of those rafters and those joists that are cantilevered out. It gets pretty complicated.
Do you guys see this home style very often?
I agree.
Have you seen this a lot? This style home?
I've never seen one that overhangs the front like this on a cape style house. It's common on a 2-story house, but not on at least not in our part of the country.
Yeah.
And I've never seen a house with like an overhanging gable end. I mean, like gable ends have overhangs to do that job. My guess is that they just needed to squeeze some extra square footage on the upstairs, and perhaps there were setback requirements or tax penalties associated with a bigger lower level footprint, which is the case in some older towns. But it's oddly shaped, I gotta say. I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah.
But he's on the right track. He's asking all the right questions, right?
Definitely.
This comes from AJ. Hey, you guys have been doing a great job with the remote podcast, and I'm greatly enjoying the Pro Talk podcast as well. I just listened to the episode with Peter Jost, and one question that Patrick brought up is something I've been curious about for a long while. Where can you learn accurate information on building science? I feel the genre is piecemealed. I'm thirsty for information, but my learning comes from scattered articles. And as mentioned, very few schools are teaching it. It would be wonderful if there were an online course. Maybe Peter Yost can help development. Maybe the Building Science Corporation. I'm currently reading Buildings Don't Lie from one of your podcaster suggestions, and it's an excellent source of info. Joe Steebrook is coming to my area this fall for a talk. I hope it's not canceled. This is a great question.
Yeah.
So
this question actually set
I
me
started
on a
digging
really...
into building science program.
So I know you said you have some stuff, Kiley, but do you want to get started since you did a little bit of research on this?
Yeah,
I've got some good points too, but I'll let you start.
I found something that actually set me in motion. I was talking to Brian about this because I'm working with Green Building Advisor a little bit now, and there's the Building Performance Institute has a building science principles online course that you can take, and I'm actually going to take it. So today I will be ordering the book, and the exam together is like $228 or something, $228. And the reference guide it looks pretty hefty. I've got some studying to do, but I think it looks like a pretty worthy program. And I'm going to write about how, what Brian would like for me to do a blog post about what I learned and how the exam is. And so I will be reviewing the course and the book. So that's kind of cool. I'm looking forward to that. But
that's awesome.
Yeah. And he also mentioned that, this listener already knows this, Steve is coming to his town on Peter Joist, but Brian made the point that we should probably start doing this on GBA, right? These guys do their day-long and multi-day intros classes, but somehow maybe we can funnel all of that to GBA and make it some kind of course.
Well, on that point, he said maybe Peter Joist could develop a course.
Right.
Back when I was at GBA, maybe about 8 years ago, Peter was asked to build a basic building science course that was part of this Train the Trainers program for Green Raiders. And the videos, which are basically like a 2-day seminar that he did, are somewhere on the GBA website. They were never really intended to be for the general public, but they're available there. But you also pointed out in the reader's question, Building Science Corporation. Well, Building Science Corporation is one of several companies that is affiliated with the Department of Energy and a couple other government organizations as part of the Building America program. And these different, so if you go to Building Science Corporation's website, all of those research papers are public access because a lot of them are funded with public Department of Energy funds. And though they have a really good library of their own research papers, if you go to the Building America Solutions Center, which is part of the Department of Energy, I'll put a link to that in the podcast notes. There is a pretty comprehensive resource there with building science basics and different things about specific construction processes. And it's actually pretty extensive, but it's one of these things that's been funded by the government for decades, I think, and most people don't know about.
What would you guys have to say? Haven't you both attended a Building Science Corps summer camp?
I've never been to the summer camp. That's a very small kind of group of people who are usually big, heavy hitters in the industry getting together to do presentations. But I have been to some of Joe Steebrook's presentations, like the course that AJ's talking about here. And those do happen around the country. They're usually 2-day.
I haven't been to the Building Science Summer Camp either, but I'm fishing for an invitation. So if anyone from there is listening, I'd love to go. I started digging into programs, and there are some around the country. Rensselaer has one. One that seemed really interesting to me is Appalachian State University. And for those of you listening in the Southern Appalachians, I said Appalachia because that's how they say it down there. But where I'm from, up in the Northern Appalachians, we say it Appalachian. So those of you who've read in on my pronunciation of Appalachia, I know there are two. It depends on where you live, which is right. Anyway, so they have a beautiful campus in Boone, North Carolina, which is in the mountains of North Carolina near Asheville. I would want to take that one just because it's such a lovely spot. But they seem to have all the necessary entities talking about envelopes and control layers and all this stuff. And there are also PhD programs. It seems like they're often associated with architecture schools around the country. So, I mean, there are options out there. And I would totally agree with this listener's comments is that, yeah, sometimes it's a little disjointed because, you know, in real terms, it's a very new science. We're talking about what? If you go back as the earliest, you're talking about the 50s. And I think most people would say that got going in earnest in the 70s during the oil crisis. So we're getting there, I hope.
Yep.
And Rob's going to develop a curriculum for GBA, right?
I'll help. That's for sure. It wouldn't be the first time I did that. But yeah, actually, back to Kiley's point.
What do you think is the best way for someone to learn building science, Rob?
Well, actually, I think Kiley did a good job at digging that up, because BPI, the nice thing about that is that the courses that the Building Performance Institute gives, a lot of them are the courses that people in the industry, you know, people who do air sealing and blower door testing and all that stuff, are taking. And you know, they're relatively affordable short-term courses to at least get your feet wet and get your head wrapped around the basic concepts, so that you can probably go to some of the deeper sources and be better prepared to digest the information.
I've got a lot of studying
Kiley, have you gotten
do.
your BPI materials yet?
No, I have to order them today. This is brand new to me, but I want to thank AJ for this question, because I think it's going to be very beneficial to do that.
What are they printed stuff, or is it on a
it's a big
website,
fat
or how does it work?
I'll send you the link, and I'll put the link on the web on the podcast page too. It looks like a hefty
So what
book.
what will your certification be if you
Not
pass
sure.
this test?
The big if. Sure, that's a good question. I'll find out. I can say I passed the test, I think.
So this
I think Kiley's going to
I'm gonna
become
get you a
weatherization
t-shirt.
contractor after this.
Right. I'm going to get into HVACs. We'll see. I'll keep you.
I hope
I'll
you
keep
do,
posted.
Kiley, because
I'm
you'll
gonna
do a
it.
much better job than the people who are doing it now. Yeah. You're going to do great.
So, what's your end
Guys
note?
have anything to add to this? Do you want to talk about fancy, Rob?
Yeah, what's fancy? What are you guys talking about?
Fancy?
Discussion.
What are we talking about?
So fancy is the handle of one of our internet YouTube commenters, and it would be unfair to call him a troll.
Yeah, that guy.
Because he's like among the nicest trolls that exist, right? The guy is really not a troublemaker, but every episode of the podcast, he puts the comment, Snoozanne Summers, and we've all gotten a big joke, a laugh out of it, right? And Matt thinks it's hysterical, but I believe it was for 245, or maybe it was 243. But anyway, Fancy had a different comment, and he said, "Lovely and interesting podcast," I believe is what he said. So, Fancy, I'm glad we're doing better for you. Stick around; it's only going to get better.
That's a big deal.
I wasn't aware of that comment. I have to go check that out.
It's breaking the mold.
We welcome all listeners, so thank you for the kind sentiment, Fancy. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Kiley, Rob, and Jeff for joining me, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com, and please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Thanks very much for listening. Happy building. Keep craft alive.